Franchise players are often referred to as the face of the franchise.
Welcome back into Franchise Players here on WWBG 1470 AM and WTOB 980 AM. Of course, you can catch us on the Tobacco Road Sports Radio Podcast Network and the Tobacco Road YouTube channel. I guess hell froze over because something that a lot of people in the tribe probably thought they never were going to see is actually going down. In the house, host of The Drive with Josh Graham, 3 to 6 p.m. Monday through Fridays on WSJS. It's Josh Graham. Mr. Graham, what's up, man?
I thought you were going to say, like, Elliot Cadeau started a basketball game for Carolina. That's something that I'm just kidding. It's good that we're able to do this, man. Good to see you, Des.
Man, I'm feeling good. My Carolina Tar Heels doing their thing. We just had David Glenn on right before you, and I mentioned to him that they look like a Dean Smith Carolina team to me. The way the roster is built, like it's 9-10 deep. He's got multiple point guards that can run. Elliot Cadeau had like double-digit assists the other night with no turnovers. Like we haven't seen that in 3 years from Carolina.
Oh, really? We just haven't seen, like, a couple nights ago when they played. It was one of those things, Des. They're pushing the pace, and they got draft picks on this team. Like, off the top of your head, do you know the last time Carolina had a player drafted?
Either Cole Anthony or
Day'Ron Sharpe.
Yeah.
Day'Ron Sharpe in 2021. The last 2 years, they haven't had a draft pick. This year, it looks like they have multiple draft picks. That hasn't happened in 5 years almost. And the win against Tennessee, that was the first win that North Carolina had, a non-conference top 10 win since Gonzaga, December the 15th in 2018. So, yeah, you should feel really good about your Tar Heels.
I was not expecting Cormac Ryan to look like this. I was definitely not expecting Harrison Ingram to look like this coming in. I was not expecting them up by 23 on Tennessee in the first half, dropping 61. Like I'm here for it because all of my other teams suck right now, and I need a boost because Carolina, the Tar Heels are the only ones. I want to talk about these Panthers, and I listened to The Drive. We've talked often. I've just called The Drive last week, if I'm not mistaken. We've talked about the situation in Carolina. I wanted to do common sense with you. It's a thing we do here where basically I've compiled 8 different potential either candidates, rumored candidates, or guys that the fans want. So I've compiled this list of 8 coaches that I want you to basically describe. Does it make sense for Carolina to pursue? Or that doesn't make any sense at all. And then just, quick explanation as to why. Let's just start with the very, very top. Former Panther quarterback Cam Newton came out with this suggestion, I think like yesterday or day before. New England head coach and do-all front office man Bill Belichick. Does it make sense or does it not make sense?
It makes more sense than people might think because of how much the Patriots have struggled this year and the fact that he's 72 years old or will be 72 next season. There aren't going to be a lot of NFL teams lining up to give this man full control of their football operation, similar to what David Tepper did when he brought Matt Rule in. I feel like Carolina would be a team to do that. I think Tepper, for the appeal of bringing in Belichick and the credibility that comes along with that, wouldn't mind giving that type of control away, assuming his time in New England's done. And there's the appeal on the Belichick end of doing it on your own, like Cam Newton mentioned on the podcast. And in addition to that, he's a guy who cares about his legacy. Like, everybody pins him as being this guy that doesn't really talk much. He's just, a curmudgeon with the media. And that's true. But when you get him to open up about the history of football and he talks about what some of these records and these milestones mean, like, you're talking about 16 wins away from the career wins mark in the NFL. He's going to want to achieve that. And if that's not going to happen in Foxborough, it's probably going to happen somewhere else. He has a tight relationship with Nick Saban. His offensive coordinator in New England was, a former head coach and Bill O'Brien, who was Bryce Young's coordinator at Alabama. There are a lot of things that connect this together. The appeal of coaching Bryce, probably getting more control than you would at some of the openings across the NFL. And then Tepper, of course, getting a guy that he can trust to know Bryce is going to be well surrounded with a good quality coaching staff. And I mean, he always looks to make the splashy hire. What's splashier than Belichick?
I only have two concerns with that. A is his age. Tepper comments, although that was word salad the other day with Tepper at the press conference, but him talking about he would like to hire a guy that he could have for 20, 30 years. I don't think that's Belichick. But another thing too, the Panther fan base hates Bill Belichick. Like, we kind of have a Coach K relationship, Carolina type thing with Belichick. Like, I don't know if the fan base would be I'm trying to picture that. Like the press conference
the
when they're
age,
bringing Belichick in.
I'll dispel the age one and saying that, hey, he's going to stick around until he at least breaks that record. And if he does that in 2 years, then winning 16 games in a 2-year stretch, a lot better than what's happened before. And I mean, it's a year-to-year league, the NFL. So if you get him for 2 to 3 years and he puts you in the right direction versus what the last 5 years have been, I'm not worried about the age piece at all.
All right, that's a good segue into option number 2, one that I've seen starting to pop up now. Alabama head coach Nick Saban, who's actually older than Bill Belichick, if I'm not mistaken.
No.
Doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for Saban. I think he's content at Alabama. He's built the thing. He is the oldest coach, or actually the second oldest coach in FBS football behind Mac Brown by about 2 months. So I think he's set. I don't think he's a guy that, I mean, he's had enough success. I don't think he would want to leave that, especially at the age he's at. Even though Belichick's pretty much at the same age, things have soured in Foxborough in a way that they're not souring in Tuscaloosa.
Yeah, Alabama might be in the football playoff by the time we get to this point next week. So yeah, I can't see Saban coming back to the NFL, period. He seems like Alabama's his last stop, I would think. So the ones that are out there asking for Alabama Nick Saban to come in and interview, that doesn't make any sense. Josh Graham with us here, host of The Drive with Josh Graham, 3 to 6 p.m. on WSJS. Follow him on Twitter /X at Josh Graham Show. I'm probably never going to really comfortable calling it X. I'm still calling it Twitter. I don't think anybody minds. Yeah, it's still twitter.com. So it's like, I'm probably going to still continue to do it. Let me get into this pool of offensive coordinators that are floating around. The biggest one, Detroit Lions offensive coordinator Ben Johnson, interviewed here once, I think last year, didn't do a second interview. I've seen it going around where, he declined a second interview with Carolina. He don't want to be here. He declined it with everyone. He wanted to go back to Detroit and run it back one more time. He probably won't be able to do that again this time around. He's probably going to land somewhere. Does it make sense, or that doesn't make any sense?
Makes sense. It makes sense for the Panthers, but it doesn't. I don't know if it makes sense for Ben Johnson, just because he was not the flashy coordinator name a year ago. That was Shane Steichen, who got the Colts job. And there were a few others that got head coaching jobs. D'Amico Ryans, who ended up getting the Texans gig, and he's doing a great job down there in Houston. Those were the flashy guys a year ago. Ben Johnson's the flashy name now. And when you look at it, you're probably, there's some experts that are projecting, usually you have 6 to 8 changes per hire or per cycle in the NFL. Some are projecting there could be as many as 9. So when you're talking about that level of turnover this year, and almost certainly one of them being the Chargers opportunity where Justin Herbert is available to be coached, and organizations that have had a lot more stability than the Panthers, like the Green Bay Packers, maybe like the New England Patriots, getting to be the first hire that a new owner makes if Washington comes free as well. It just seems like there are too many options available for Ben Johnson to choose the Carolina Panthers out of those options.
Excellent points there. I wasn't really on the Ben Johnson train. So if that happens, I don't know if I want them to go offensive coordinator again like this. But we'll get on that in just a second. Houston offensive coordinator Bobby Slowick. I didn't realize he's actually from the Shanahan tree, which is kind of something I wanted and thought we were kind of getting when we brought Thomas Brown in as offensive coordinator. Does that make sense, or that doesn't make sense?
Makes a ton of sense. This is if you want to go the young, innovative offensive mind route, the Panthers would love to hire Ben Johnson, but this is the next best choice, because the Carolina Panthers are they're dead last by a mile when it comes to pre-snap motion. And the point you just hit about him being in the Shanahan tree should tell you that the Texans run a lot of pre-snap motion. And if you want to do pre-snap motion RPO with Bryce Young, well, Bobby Slowick's a good guy to bring in to do that. Also, there were reports, widely reported in the spring, that if the Texans had the number 1 pick, they would have taken Bryce Young. D'Amico Ryans is a defensive-minded head coach, so the most important hire he was going to make is the offensive guy. And if you were going to hire an offensive coordinator, when you're a defensive-minded coach, odds are his opinion was going to be the most important in the room on what quarterback you take in that spot. That tells me that Bobby Slowick wanted to coach Bryce Young out of the two guys. So there might be an appeal there as well. There's an appeal for him to coach Bryce, and also a system fit as well to try and juice up this offense that wasn't very creative under Frank Reich.
You just got Bobby Slowick an asterisk beside his name, because I'm literally looking through my list. Like, I don't know for sure. I have one guy at the very end that I'm pretty much on, but I want to be convinced on some of these other ones, and you just convinced me on Bobby Slowick. That, because the one thing to me is that they've got to want to know what to do with Bryce. Like, they can't, they can't just toss that to side and be like, let's just start fresh. Like, you gave up so much to get to Bryce Young. It has to work. So you've got to find somebody, whether it's an offensive minded head coach, or for me, preferably a defensive minded head coach with an offensive kind of wonder kid at offensive coordinator that you'll have for 2 or 3 years to get Bryce going. If it's got to be offensive mind, I like Slowick more than Ben Johnson, just from what you just said, from coming from the Kyle Shanahan tree. And I just saw a thing online with what the 49ers are doing in terms of like tight ends and like pre-snap motion and blocks and stuff. And it's just, they're running the same sets basically, but there's moving people around, and it's just cool to watch. And we don't do that. We don't do that at all. Like, we don't have hardly any pre-snap movement whatsoever. Commanders offensive coordinator Eric Bieniemy. I've seen his name pop up now in both cycles here. There's something's going on whenever he interviews for head coaching gigs, because it's not just one place. It's like everywhere he goes to interview, he just never gets it. And I don't know if he's a bad interview or something about his personality. I don't know what it is, because he's got the resume, but would you bring him in to interview? Does that make sense, or does that not make sense?
Well, the reason he wasn't getting the head coaching jobs is because he wasn't calling the plays with Kansas City. And that largely was a problem. It's something that is a concern that a lot of people had. And 1 year in Washington in which the head coach is probably going to get fired, him being the offensive coordinator, probably isn't enough of a sample to say for sure that Eric Bieniemy was the answer in Kansas City, or is this innovative offensive mind that's worth surrounding everything around. I hope one day that it is for Eric Bieniemy, but I don't think enough has changed from the Panthers interviewing him when they hired Matt Rule 3 years ago, and not really considering him at all a year ago, to think that, yep, that's a guy they're identifying to be a head coaching candidate this cycle.
Let's stay in DC. Commanders head coach Ron Rivera. Does that make sense? Or does that not make sense?
No, that doesn't. I mean, I don't know if he's on your list later, but I'll put him in the same box of the Greg Olson category.
I forgot to put him on here.
Let's get out of the nostalgia here. Obviously, Ron would be a better coach than Greg Olson, but I think you leave that one in the past. You don't pull Hornets and go back to the well and hire the coach from 5 years ago.
I've always said, and your producer Will Dalton will appreciate this, that there's like 3 moments on the timeline for the Panthers where if I could go back, like with the Infinity Stones, and have it like change it or whatever, one of them would be I probably would have gave Ron another year and let him try to rebuild the roster himself. He earned that right. He was a 2-time coach of the year. He ran through like 5 quarterbacks that last year that he was here, it felt like. And then Tepper just dumps him in the middle of the season as if like all this is your fault. And now, in hindsight, looking at Tepper and how he kind of handles these situations, he probably should have gave Rivera another year. The Christian McCaffrey thing is another point on the timeline where I'm like, okay, that's where we were like panicking and we just traded him off for no reason, pretty much. Like, we didn't even know what we were going to be, and we traded him off for nothing. And now he's an MVP candidate. And
well, I'll disagree for this. I think you're right on the McCaffrey point, but I think it's before I don't think the regret is that they traded him off when they did. The regret is that you didn't trade him off a year and a half before that, when everybody left. The reason they did it was because they lost so many familiar names, but you could have got peak value for him at that point. And I don't think Ron Rivera would have wanted to have the redo on the Infinity Stone. I think if you gave him the option, hey, would you like that one more year with the Panthers? No.
Nope.
And he should be thanking David Tepper to a degree, because when he fired him when he did, that's the reason he was allowed to get the Washington Commanders job. Like, he said that month away from football, if he didn't have that decompression period, he would not have wanted to be considered for head coaching job. So the fact he was fired, and by the way, his last game was against Washington before he got fired.
That's right.
He probably would not have taken that job with Washington. So, and he's a tens of millions of dollars richer.
That's weird too, because I'm just now remembering that whole sequence was weird. The way they fired him, but they still let him say goodbye. You remember that? Like he had the little press conference. You never get a press conference when you get fired like that in the NFL.
Yep.
They let him say his thing, and you're right. He got the opportunity to settle in there, and Marty Herney's over there with him now too in DC. And but I don't know if Ron's going to make it past Black Monday or Bloody Monday at the end of the year. Oh boy, 49ers defensive coordinator Steve Wilks. Does that make sense? Does that not make sense?
It makes sense, but is David Tepper going to be willing to do it? It does, because like if you just eliminate the past, which you can't do in his instance, but let's just say you do. 49ers have the #1 defense in the NFL right now. Like, what if you just view it as hot defensive coordinator who has head coaching experience with the Cardinals and didn't get a real opportunity, Steve Wilks? And you just eliminate the other stuff. I mean, the guy was here when the Panthers went 15-1. The guy last year obviously turned around this team. A lot of the personnel is still there. If David Tepper's willing to swallow his pride, which I don't know if he's willing to do, I hope he is willing to do that. He should be a serious candidate for this job again. And I hear people say, oh, well, he wouldn't even take that phone call. Yeah, he would. Still the Panthers. That place means a lot to him. And he still wants to be a head coach. And he still, I mean, Charlotte is still his home, whether or not David Tepper owns the football team that happens to reside there. I have less concern about Steve Wilks being willing to listen to that call than I do confidence that David Tepper would go back to that well.
I kind of look at, because I was like that at first with him. I'm like, why would I go back there? Like, you know, the way I was treated. But then I started looking at it like in terms of like boyfriend, girlfriend. Say like the Carolina Panthers are the love of Steve Wilks' life. And something happened and it didn't work out. He asked him to marry him or whatever. And the Panthers said no. Panthers move on. They're dating somebody else. He moves to the West Coast. Sees it all happening. It's kind of like the I Used to Love Her Common song with hip hop. Anyway, like he's seeing all this happen. They break up. Would Steve Wilks get back with that woman that was the love of his life? Like, that's basically the question you're asking. And I've heard Wilks kind of say things, and he hasn't said anything specifically about the Panthers. I think he said something like he's not looking to head coach right now or something like that. But that's word salad too. Like, they're not looking right now because they're a defensive coordinator. But if someone offers them a head coaching job, they're going to be like, yeah, I'll do it. Especially if it's, you know, where he went to high school and grew up and everything else. That
went to the Super Bowl with.
Went to the Super Bowl with greatest season in franchise history. Like, I mean, that would be the way for Tepper to pull the fans back to his side. I just don't know if Wilks would want to do it or not. And that's kind of the one out there that, because you still got to figure out what to do with Bryce Young if you bring in Wilks. Like, what's his plan with him? So on the roster already, Panthers defensive coordinator Ejiro Evero. Does that make sense, or does that not make sense?
It doesn't. He just they're gonna turn the page from this era of Panthers football, and Ejiro unfortunately is a casualty of that.
Because I actually like him.
I like him too, but it's you don't fire a coaching staff 11 games in if you intend to hire somebody who's already on that staff, and it's just they're going to want. It's pretty clear that he wants to rip the Band-Aid and do something new, and when you do that, you don't hire from within, which also eliminates Jim Caldwell and some of those other candidates that are.
Yeah, it's crazy too, because when they first put this together in the preseason, we were all looking at the staff. I looked at it and I was like, you know what? It almost looks like he has fail safes built in. Like, say this doesn't work. Okay, you've got two young candidates that were interviewing for head coaching jobs in this cycle, and Thomas Brown and Ejiro Evero in your offensive and defensive coordinator positions. You've got Jim Caldwell here, Don Capers is here. You've got all these dudes that everyone's saying are going to be future head coaches, and then you just ball it up and throw it away after 11 games. Now, granted, we saw the game, so we understand why. But like, still, it's just like they're all going to probably be gone, because whoever comes in is going to want their own staff. They're not going to keep Frank Reich's staff and just like hop in. So yeah, I guess you're right. So
it's more like quarterback, when people have, oh man, we got 2, maybe 3 quarterbacks who can start for us. If you have 2 or 3 quarterbacks who can start for you, you don't have one. If you have 5 head coaches on your team, you might not have one good one.
And that my man, I think that was the problem with the 2023 Carolina Panthers. They had too many coaches in the room where there was no identity because of it. And the proof's in the pudding when you watch it on the field. I saved the best for last. He's my favorite. He's the one. I've been doing podcasts on this subject for 2 years now. And dude actually even called in last year. Like, hey, what's going on? Heard you got a job down there. Michigan head coach Jim Harbaugh. Does it make sense? Does it not make sense?
It makes sense for many of the same reasons we were just talking about with Belichick. Like, there's this misconception that owners, even the meddlesome ones or the hands-on ones, that they want to be hands-on for the sake of being hands-on. But really, even when you think of the most hands-on owners there have ever been, Jerry Jones and Dan Snyder, even they've gone through phases where they've identified somebody that they respect enough, their football resume, that they were able to turn things over with no problem and a lot of control. You think of Dan Snyder with Joe Gibbs. You think of Jerry Jones with Bill Parcells, like being able to, hey, I respect Bill Parcells enough that he's going to have control of this operation. A year ago, Jonathan Jones reported it from CBS Sports that Jim Harbaugh inquired into the Panthers job, not the other way around. And the Panthers didn't have a lot of interest because they just had the Matt Rule college experience where they gave a lot of power to Matt Rule and they gave him player personnel say, and all that. A year later, is David Tepper in a place now removed from that where he'd be willing to sacrifice that or give that to Jim Harbaugh? That remains to be seen, but that probably is what Jim Harbaugh is going to be asking for. And if other openings, say the Chargers with Justin Herbert or some of these others, aren't willing to give that to the Panthers, but the Panthers are willing to give that to Harbaugh, that is something that should be seriously considered.
I feel like it's us and the Bears. Like it's us and the Bears because he's got history of the Bears. He played for them and all that good stuff.
But they have that general manager that I don't think they're going to get rid of because he's done a really good job.
Really good job.
If it came down to the Panthers and the Bears, but and both teams wanted Harbaugh, and the Panthers are offering player personnel say, then I think that he'd probably choose the Panthers, assuming that both those teams have that level of interest in Harbaugh. And here's one more thing, that there are NFL rules that go against every single candidate that you've talked about thus far to this point, short of Ejiro Evero.
Yeah, let them know.
Right, are guys who are going to make the playoffs likely, assuming that the Texans make it with Bobby Slowick, which means there are rules against the Panthers having in-person interviews with every single candidate that you mentioned until the divisional round of the playoffs. The one guy that they can talk to unencumbered out of the guys that you've mentioned, oh, I guess Saban too, but let's disregard him for a second, is right here with Jim Harbaugh. And I guess Belichick too, if he doesn't make the playoffs, obviously. So many of the candidates, Carolina won't have a chance to speak to until the second round of the playoffs. The fact that they've already moved off of the coach, and they're one of two teams that have done that, them and the Raiders. If you want to get a head start on a candidate and start vetting Jim Harbaugh, no NFL rule stops you from doing that right now.
I'm so glad you brought that up because the timing of this made me feel like, oh, Tepper already knows who he wants to hire. Like if he's doing it right now, he already knows who he wants to hire. My mind just went blank. The general manager, Scott Fitterer, he's going to be there till that last Monday, that Black Monday, because you need somebody to run football operations for the most part. Transactions, things of that sort. And what I was mentioning before about the Brian Burns situation, I feel like he's still there kind of for that. But if that falls apart, that's going to be his lasting impression on Carolina. He's not going to be here next year. So for people worried about Scott Fitterer, why is he still here? There's reasons for this. It's just the same reason why, Thomas Brown's still here, or the part of the coaching staff still here. They still have to run a team. So and you're just moving up. Dan Morgan would be doing the same thing. So,
or if you're hiring Jim Harbaugh or Bill Belichick to be the de facto general manager, why does it really matter if Scott Fitterer's heel? He could still have that position in the same way that Thomas Brown is the offensive coordinator, but he's not a play caller. Like, there are other things you could do behind the scenes, and Scott Fitterer could remain in place, but not have that player personnel say if you were to bring in one of these other guys. He could keep the position in name, but one of these guys could be the de facto.
Yeah, like Harbaugh show or whatever. I could see that happening because Fitterer does kind of feel like a yes man for David Tepper. So real quick before I get you out of here, man, who do you want in the college football playoff? Just give me your 4. Like, if you could just throw away results and what you think is going to happen, who's the top 4 teams that you would want in the college football playoff to make it enjoyable for Josh Graham to watch?
I can't give you 4, but I'll give you 3 because I do think there are 3 teams that can win a national championship that I think have separated themselves from everybody else. And that is Michigan, Georgia, and Washington. I think those are the best teams. I get it. Florida State's unbeaten as well. Obviously, Jordan Travis going down. Out of the one-loss teams, Alabama, they're flawed and have been. We saw that against Auburn where they needed a miracle in order to win. Ohio State, yeah, they have one loss and it's just to Michigan on the road. But, people call Marvin Harrison Jr. Maserati Marv. Their quarterback might as well be named Honda McCord. That guy, he's mid and he's been mid all year long. So I don't want to watch them in the playoff. I don't want to watch Florida State. I don't want to watch Alabama. Yeah. Texas, I think if I had to pick out of that next group teams I would like to see there, I wouldn't mind seeing them. Maybe Oregon if you could get 2 Pac-12 teams, but I don't think that's likely to happen. So I'll include Texas being back, so to speak, in the college football playoff for the first time. Along with those 3 top teams, having Texas there as the 4th, I think would be the most enjoyable playoff for me.
I wouldn't be mad at that. I mean, you'd be leaving Florida, an undefeated, potentially Florida State, an ACC.
Oh, no, they're in.
But this is who you would want to see, not what's going to actually happen. So
yeah, I want Louisville to win on Saturday. That's what I want.
You want chaos.
Go Cardinals. Go Cardinals.
Go follow him on Twitter at Josh Graham Show, and go listen to The Drive 3 to 6 p.m. Here in the Triad on WSJS. Y'all are familiar with it. Josh Graham, appreciate you, man.
Thanks, Des.
Coming up, we've got the host from the Cat Cave coming in. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Carolina Panthers, and we'll talk a little WWE too. You're listening to Franchise Players here on TobaccoRoadSportsRadio.com.
All right, Des.